Sven stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the lapels of his overcoat with practiced precision. He had always been this way, steady, reliable, and methodical. Yeşli used to find these qualities comforting, even endearing. But after 25 years of marriage, that reliability felt more like routine, and the routine felt suffocating. It wasn't Sven's fault, she reminded herself. It was just the way things had turned out. "Don't forget to water the hydrangeas," Sven said, his tone kind but distant. He was leaving for yet another business trip, the 5th one this quarter. He always tried to ease the inconvenience with small gestures, but Yeşli knew the truth. His job had become the third partner in their marriage. She nodded absent-mindedly, not looking up from her cup of tea. At the doorway, Sven paused, his blue eyes softening. "Take care, Yeş. I'll miss you." "I'll miss you too," she replied quietly, forcing a small smile. The door clicked shut, leaving the house engulfed in silence. For a moment, Yeşli sat motionless, the weight of her husband's absence settling over her. Then, guilt crept in, sharp and insistent. She knew Sven loved her in his own way, even if he rarely expressed it. But she also knew the growing void in their marriage wasn't entirely his fault. Her thoughts shifted to Erik, Sven's younger brother. Erik was everything Sven wasn't: spontaneous, carefree, and a little reckless. Where Sven exuded calm precision, Erik had a magnetic energy that seemed to draw people in. Over the years, Yeşli and Erik had developed a friendly rapport, often bonding over their mutual frustration with Sven's rigidity. But lately, their conversations had taken a more personal turn, delving into their shared feelings of isolation and unmet desires. It started innocently enough: an extra-long hug at a family gathering, a casual text exchange. Erik would drop by occasionally when Sven was away, ostensibly to check on her. Yeşli told herself there was no harm in it, even as her heart raced whenever he arrived. This time was no different. She was trimming the hydrangeas in the garden when Erik's car pulled up in the driveway. He stepped out, wearing a leather jacket and a grin that hinted at trouble. "Catching you in the act again, eh?" he teased, nodding toward the pruning shears in her hand. "Just keeping Sven's hydrangeas alive," she replied, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "Well, they look better than ever. Must be your magic touch," Erik said, his tone softening as he stepped closer. Yeşli's heart skipped a beat. "What are you doing here, Erik?" "I just thought I'd stop by, make sure you're not too lonely." Hours later, they were seated in the living room, a bottle of wine between them. Erik leaned back on the couch, his gaze steady and intense. "Do you ever feel stuck?" he asked, his voice low. Yeşli hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "Sometimes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Erik leaned forward, his hand brushing against hers. "You deserve more than this, Yeş. You deserve to feel alive." The words hung in the air, electrifying and dangerous. Yeşli's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, and she saw a glimpse of a life filled with excitement, passion, and freedom. It was terrifying and intoxicating. Before she could process her thoughts, Erik leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't the tentative, practiced kiss she had grown accustomed to with Sven. It was fiery, raw, and overwhelming. Her mind screamed at her to stop, but her body refused to obey. In that moment, the life she had known crumbled beneath the weight of her choices. Yeşli's heart began to beat faster as she pulled away, her breathing ragged. Erik's lips lingered near hers, his eyes searching hers for a sign of regret or rejection. She should have said something, stopped him, explained how wrong this was, but the words didn't come. Instead, she froze, the room spinning around her. Erik broke the silence first, his voice low and even. "I've wanted this for so long, Yeş." His admission made her flinch. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He sighed and leaned back, running a hand through his tousled hair. "You were always the one, Yeşli. Even when Sven first brought you home all those years ago, I couldn't take my eyes off you. But I had no right to say anything. You were his, and he was my brother." She stared at him, trying to process his words. Memories of family dinners, holidays, and casual conversations flashed through her mind. Had she missed the signs? Lingering glances? Unnecessary attention? "I'm sorry," he continued. "I've tried to keep away, to suppress it, but I can't anymore. Every time I see you, I think about what could have been." Yeşli shook her head, conflicted. "Erik, it's wrong. Sven doesn't see you, Erik," interrupted, his voice tinged with disappointment. "Not like I do. He's so caught up in his work, in his own affairs, that he's forgotten how incredible you are." His words pierced her defenses, opening wounds she'd tried to ignore for years. She hated that Erik's words resonated, that they made her feel seen in a way Sven hadn't in so long. She terrified herself of how much she wanted to believe him. The tension between them crackled like a live wire. Erik stood and moved closer, kneeling in front of her. "Tell me you don't feel this too," he said softly, his hands resting on hers. "Tell me you don't want this." Yeşli opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her silence was answer enough. Erik leaned in, this time slower, giving her the chance to stop him. But she didn't. When their lips met again, it was different. Softer, more deliberate. His hand slid up her arms, pulling her closer until she felt the heat of his body against hers. For a moment, the guilt evaporated, replaced by a rush of desire she hadn't felt in years. Erik guided her gently, his touch reverent as he led her to the couch. The room seemed to blur as their kisses deepened, his hands exploring the curves of her body with an urgency that left her breathless. When he paused to look at her, his expression was a mix of longing and awe, as if he couldn't believe this was real. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Yeşli hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. But when she met his gaze, the ache of loneliness and unmet desire overwhelmed her. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Erik's movements were slow and deliberate, as if savoring every moment. He laid her back, their bodies tangling in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. The lines between guilt and pleasure blurred as they lost themselves in each other, their shared longing finally finding an outlet. The room was quiet except for their ragged breaths as they lay tangled on the couch, the aftermath of their actions sinking in. Yeşli stared at the ceiling, her emotions swirling, regret, exhilaration, fear. Erik turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I don't want this to be just one night," he said softly. "I want to give you everything Sven never could." His words made her heart ache. She couldn't deny the spark between them, but the reality of what they'd done loomed over her like a shadow. Sven's face flashed in her mind, his steadfast love and unwavering trust. How could she face him after this? "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what this means yet." Erik nodded, though his disappointment was clear. "I'll wait," he said, "as long as it takes." Yeşli sat up, wrapping herself in the throw blanket from the couch. Her mind raced as she tried to process the whirlwind of emotions and decisions ahead. She couldn't ignore what had happened, but she also couldn't pretend it hadn't changed everything. The days after their night together were a blur for Yeşli. Every moment alone felt suffocating, her thoughts a constant churn of guilt and longing. Sven called from his business trip, his voice steady and reassuring, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and Yeşli felt like a stranger in her own skin. Erik, however, was anything but distant. It began with texts, short, simple messages designed to keep the connection alive. Thinking about you. I can't stop replaying that night. You deserve more than what you have now, Yesh. Yeşli ignored them at first, deleting each message as soon as it arrived. She tried to tell herself that what had happened was a mistake, a lapse in judgment fueled by loneliness and vulnerability. But Erik wasn't letting her forget. A week later, he showed up unannounced. Yeşli was in the kitchen, scrubbing the counters with a force born of nervous energy, when the doorbell rang. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Peering through the window, she saw Erik standing on the porch, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. She hesitated before opening the door. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "I needed to see you," Erik replied, his gaze earnest. "You've been ignoring me." Yeşli crossed her arms, trying to maintain her composure. "We can't do this, Erik. What happened between us? It was wrong." "It didn't feel wrong," he countered, stepping closer. "Not to me. It felt like something we've both been waiting for." Her resolve wavered under the weight of his words. She looked away, trying to steady her breathing. "I can't betray Sven like this. He's my husband, your brother." Erik reached out, gently tilting her face back toward him. "And what about you, Yesh? What about what you need? Sven has his work, his trips, his perfectly organized life. But who's there for you? Who sees you?" His hand lingered on her cheek, and for a moment she let herself lean into his touch. The warmth of his palm was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the cold guilt that had been gnawing at her since that night. "I can't," she whispered, pulling away. "Please, Erik, don't make this harder than it already is." Erik didn't give up. Over the following weeks, his efforts became more determined. He sent flowers to her doorstep with no note, just a silent acknowledgement that he was thinking of her. He found excuses to stop by, dropping off tools Sven had borrowed, offering to help fix the squeaky front gate. Each time, Yeşli felt her defenses weaken. Erik had a way of looking at her, of speaking to her, that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. But every stolen glance and lingering touch deepened her guilt. One evening, as she sat on the couch scrolling aimlessly through her phone, another message from Erik appeared. "Meet me, just once. No pressure. I just want to talk." Yeşli stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the delete button. She knew she shouldn't go. She should block his number, sever the connection completely. But her curiosity and a small, traitorous part of her heart refused to let her. They met at a secluded park on the edge of town. The sun was setting, casting the world in hues of gold and crimson. Erik was waiting for her by a bench, his hands resting on the back of it as he paced nervously. "You came," he said when he saw her, relief flooding his face. Yeşli stayed a few feet away, crossing her arms defensively. "This has to stop, Erik. You can't keep showing up like this." "I know," he said quickly, his voice earnest. "I know I've been pushing, but I can't let you go, Yesh. Not without fighting for you." "Fight for me?" she repeated, incredulous. "Do you realize what you're asking? This isn't just about us. It's about Sven, our family, everything we've built." "I know," Erik said, stepping closer, "and I hate that I'm hurting him, but can you honestly say you're happy, Yesh? That you've been happy for the past 10 years? The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth was a bitter pill she wasn't ready to swallow. Erik took her silence as an answer. "You deserve to be happy, and I can give that to you. I can give you the life you've been missing." Yeşli shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not that simple. It's never that simple." "It could be," Erik insisted. his hands moving to cup her face. If you just let yourself want this, want me. For a moment, she let herself imagine it. A life with Erik. Free from the constraints of her carefully constructed world. A life where she was seen, loved, and desired. But then she thought of Sven, of his quiet devotion, his steadfast presence, and she thought of the wreckage this would leave in its wake. "I can't," she said finally, pulling away from Erik's touch. "I won't." Erik's face fell, but he didn't argue. He stepped back, his hands dropping to his sides. "If that's what you want," he said quietly, "but I'll be here if you change your mind." The days following their meeting at the park were tense. Erik's words echoed in Yeşli's mind. "You deserve to be happy." It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, with such conviction that it felt like a challenge to her entire existence. But Yeşli was determined to push Erik out of her thoughts. She threw herself into her daily routine with fervor, clinging to the familiar rhythms of her life, tending the garden, running errands, meeting friends for coffee, anything to keep her mind off the spark Erik had reignited. One evening, as she rearranged the living room furniture for the third time that month, her phone buzzed with another message from Erik. She didn't need to read it to know what it said. His persistence had become a constant drumbeat in her life, growing louder each day. This time, she decided to take a different approach. The next day, Yeşli drove to Erik's workshop on the outskirts of town. It was a small but well-kept space, filled with the smell of sawdust and the hum of machinery. Erik looked up from his workbench when she walked in, his expression shifting from surprise to hope. "Yeşli," he said, setting down a chisel. "I didn't think you'd come." "I came to tell you this needs to stop," she said firmly. "Whatever you think is happening between us, it's over. It has to be." Erik stepped closer, wiping his hands on a rag. "You can say that all you want, but we both know it's not true." Yeşli held her ground. "It doesn't matter what I feel, Erik. I made a commitment to Sven. I won't betray him any further." "And what about your commitment to yourself?" Erik countered. "You think staying in a marriage that makes you miserable is honorable? It's not. It's just fear." His words stung because they carried a kernel of truth. But Yeşli refused to let him sway her. "I'm not here to debate this with you. I'm here to tell you that you need to respect my decision. If you care about me, if you care about Sven, you'll let this go." Erik's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might argue, but then he nodded, his expression unreadable. "Fine, I'll back off, but don't expect me to stop caring about you." True to his word, Erik stopped contacting her directly. But his presence lingered in subtle ways. He dropped by Sven's house more often, claiming he needed tools or wanted to help with small repairs. He always seemed to find a reason to linger, his gaze catching Yeşli's whenever Sven wasn't looking. Yeşli knew what he was doing, reminding her he was still there, waiting. She decided to create distance, finding excuses to avoid him whenever he came around. At one Saturday, Sven suggested they invite Erik over for dinner. Yeşli's stomach clenched, but she forced a smile. "Why don't we keep it just the two of us tonight? It's been a while since we had some alone time." Sven looked surprised but pleased. "You're right, let's do that." It wasn't a lie. They did need time together. But for Yeşli, it was also a way to reclaim her space, to rebuild the foundation of her marriage without Erik's shadow looming over them. Determined to push past the temptation Erik represented, Yeşli sought ways to strengthen her connection with Sven. She planned small surprises, cooking his favorite meals, joining him on his evening walks, even suggesting a weekend getaway to a cabin they used to visit years ago. At first, Sven seemed confused by her sudden enthusiasm, but he didn't question it. Slowly, Yeşli began to see glimpses of the man she'd fallen in love with. The way his face lit up when he talked about a new project, the quiet pride in his voice when he spoke of their life together. Still, there were moments when Erik's words crept back into her mind, stirring doubts she couldn't completely silence. Was she fighting for a life that had already run its course? Or was she simply rediscovering what she had taken for granted? One evening, as Yeşli sat alone on the porch, Erik's car pulled up in the driveway. Her heart sank as he stepped out, holding a small box. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said when she opened the door. "I just wanted to give you this." She hesitated before taking the box. Inside was a delicate necklace, a simple silver chain with a tiny pendant shaped like a hydrangea. "It reminded me of you," he said softly. Yeşli closed the box, her expression firm. "Erik, I can't accept this." "It's not about accepting anything," he said. "It's about remembering who you are. And if you ever decide you want something more, you know where to find me." He turned and walked back to his car, leaving her standing in the doorway, the box heavy in her hand. Yeşli thought she had buried the past, hidden it beneath layers of denial and routine. Erik's advances had slowed to a trickle, and Sven's oblivious kindness created a fragile illusion of normalcy. But illusions have a way of shattering when least expected. It started with Sven's unexpected return home from a trip. He had told Yeşli he'd be gone for a week, but a canceled meeting meant he could catch an earlier flight. Wanting to surprise her, he didn't call ahead. As Sven pulled into the driveway, he noticed Erik's car parked just down the street. At first he thought nothing of it. Perhaps Erik had dropped by to borrow something. But as he approached the house, the sight of Erik leaving through the back door with a hurried glance over his shoulder made Sven's heart pound. Sven stepped inside, his voice steady but tinged with suspicion. "Yeşli? I'm home." Yeşli appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale and startled. "Sven, you're early." "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Canceled meeting. Thought I'd surprise you." She wiped her hands on a towel, her movements awkward. That's great. "How was your trip?" "It was fine," Sven replied, studying her closely. "But why was Erik here?" Yeşli froze, the words caught in her throat. She scrambled for a plausible explanation, but the weight of Sven's gaze made it impossible to think clearly. He just stopped by. Something about borrowing a tool." Sven nodded slowly. Strange. He didn't say hello. Left pretty quickly. The silence between them was deafening. Sven didn't press her further, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few days, he started noticing things he had overlooked before. Yeşli's nervousness when Erik's name came up. The way she avoided eye contact when he asked about her day. Unable to shake the feeling that something was off, Sven decided to investigate. One evening, while Yeşli was in the shower, he scrolled through her phone. It didn't take long to find the texts, deleted messages recovered with a simple app. Most were innocent enough on the surface, but there were fragments that hinted at something deeper. "I can't stop thinking about you. That night changed everything. I miss you." The final nail came in the form of a hidden box in Yeşli's drawer, buried beneath old scarves. Inside was the hydrangea necklace Erik had given her. Sven stared at it for what felt like an eternity, the realization crashing over him like a tidal wave. That night, Sven sat at the dining table, the necklace resting in the center. Yeşli walked in, startled to find him waiting. "Sven, you're still up?" she asked cautiously. He gestured to the necklace. "Care to explain this?" Yeşli's breath caught. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. "Is it from Erik?" Sven's voice was calm, too calm. It terrified her more than if he'd shouted. "Sven, Don't lie to me, Yeşli," he said sharply. "I found the messages. I know something's been going on. Just tell me the truth." The weight of the deception, the months of hiding and denial, finally broke her. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. "It wasn't supposed to happen, Sven. I didn't mean for it to—" "Didn't mean for what?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "To betray me? To sleep with my brother?" Yeşli flinched at his words, the raw pain in his voice cutting through her like a knife. "I was lonely," she admitted, her voice trembling. "You were always gone, and I—" "And you what?" Sven snapped. Slamming his hand on the table, "You decided my absence gave you permission to destroy everything we've built?" The next hours were a blur of anger, tears, and accusations. Sven demanded every detail: when it started, how far it had gone. Yeşli answered through sobs, her words spilling out in broken fragments. "What about Erik?" Sven asked bitterly. "Was it just once, or has this been a long-term hobby for the two of you?" "It was a mistake," Yeşli pleaded. "I ended it, I swear." But Sven wasn't listening. He grabbed his coat, the sound of the front door slamming behind him echoing through the house. Yeşli collapsed onto the couch, her chest heaving with sobs. She had feared this moment, dreaded it with every fiber of her being, but now that it had come, the reality was worse than she had imagined. Even Sven didn't return that night. When he finally came back the next day, his demeanor was cold and resolute. "I've spoken to Erik," he said flatly. "He confirmed everything." "What did you say to him?" Yeşli asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He's no longer my brother," Sven replied, his tone devoid of emotion. "And as for you," he paused, his gaze piercing, "you can keep the house. I'm filing for divorce." Yeşli's heart sank. "Sven, please don't do this. I'll do anything to fix it." "It's too late for that," Sven said, his voice breaking for the first time. "You didn't just betray me, you betrayed our life, our trust, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive that." Weeks passed, and Sven moved out, leaving Yeşli alone in the house they had shared for 25 years. Erik disappeared from their lives entirely, the weight of his actions fracturing the family beyond repair. Yeşli tried to rebuild her life, but the scars of her choices lingered. Every room in the house was a reminder of what she had lost, and as she sat in the garden, tending to the hydrangeas Sven had once cared for, she realized the bitter truth. Some mistakes are irreparable. As for Sven, he found solace in starting anew. The betrayal had changed him, hardening his once gentle demeanor, but it also gave him clarity. He deserved better, and now, finally, he was free.